Hello everybody, welcome to episode 22 of Shonen Shorts, where today we'll be going over the July 5th issue of Weekly Shonen Jump. And this week I read Underdoctor, Hall Formula, Cannon Master, and Hunter x Hunter. So let's start off with Underdoctor. Underdoctor wasn't anything really special this week. All we had was, we see as Haji ultimately ends up interacting with this girl who he healed a while back. She's been coming every once in a while, every 6 months actually, for checkups. And we see that she is madly in love with Haji. Her name is Eleanor, and she is the third daughter of the Duke of this area called Ormalia. And we learned that what Haji originally treated her of was this disease called transient autonomic dysfunction, which essentially caused her to like I guess seize up and like not seize up, but like become paralyzed in instances of like heightened emotion and stuff like that. No, we see that she ultimately was cured by him, and he gave her like a new perspective on things, and ultimately this caused her to fall madly in love with Haji. But we see as Haji himself is obviously against it because he's like the Underdoctor needs to be someone who can not necessarily someone who doesn't really rely on anyone and can go about and do their own thing. So we see this, and ultimately we see also as Chiwa and Shuli are talking, Shuli ultimately gets the idea that, if Haji spends a bunch of time with her, then I won't be able to get taught by him. So he tries to, dampen Haji's image, and Haji's like, quit making me sound like a bum. But ultimately, Eleanor's like, no, I'm still not affected by that. But ultimately, Haji ends up striking her down pretty heavily here, but not like in a not in like a cruel way, but just kind of like just laying out the facts and what he needs to be as the Underdoctor. And ultimately, she's like, well, I am going to head off now, and I know I won't get to see you every 6 months now since you did see that, I'm not likely to fall into remission, but I'm still not going to quit my endeavors. So then we go over to Hall Formula. Now, Hall Formula, so chapter starts off with us seeing as Miharu drops off Haruka at daycare, and then ultimately Miharu decides, you know what, I'm going to go practice for the Oida race, which is in, I believe, 4 weeks. And so we see as he goes to this little simulation area. Now, also we get introduced to our new character of Hinokura. Now, Hinokura he's the person who placed second in the last race, and his organization, because he is an organizational driver rather than an individual indie kind of, not indie necessarily, but individual driver like Miharu is. He drives actually for a group. And we see as his group is kind of pressed down on him because they're like, we can't take second place anymore. You need to win. And so we see as he also ends up going to this virtual testing area. So we then see as Miharu and Hinokura end up getting into a competition, and Miharu is like, if I cannot beat him here, then Mr. Kyogoku is not going to be able to show me the skills that he said he would show me if I place first. I gotta beat him here so I can beat him in real life. And we see as the race starts off, and Hinokura is beating Miharu pretty soundly, and he recognizes that Miharu is kind of a novice, but he just has that willingness to accept his fate possibly if he were to die on the track. And so we see as Hinokura ultimately kind of gets like a lead on him, and then we ultimately end up seeing as Miharu kind of figures out what the logic is behind the steering technique and the driving technique that Matsuba Kyogoku was talking to him about. I keep having trouble with his name because it is a very difficult name to remember. Kyogoku is difficult for me to remember for some reason. But yeah, so we see this, and ultimately Miharu figures out, it is in fact not to do with the hands, it's about overpowering the throttle, and that's really where the chapter ends. So we see, hopefully, next chapter as he unlocks this new understanding, then employs it within this race that he's doing with Hinokura. So then on to Cannon Master. Cannon Master, once again, was very good. I have full faith that this manga can be the next big thing if it just is allowed to continue out, because it has a lot of potential. So we see as Ura and Baharat are ultimately planning their massive strike against this Regolith, which ultimately they end up doing pretty soundly. We see that Baharat ultimately reflects all of the cannon fire from the Regolith into a spiral thing, and then we see as Ur shoots like a massive beam at it, which is then spun by Baharat, and it looks like some special beam cannon thing. Ultimately ends up hitting the Regolith and beating it. So we then see as the king of Tawat, or not Tawat, but it is Tawat, ultimately ends up talking with Baharat. He's like, you were great out there. I want to make you my successor. And Baharat's like, no, I don't need anything that crazy. I don't need anything at all. But ultimately he's like, I'll put a good word for you for this troop that's going to fight a very powerful Regolith. And he's like, yeah, he's got some of the best Slayliths within the area. I believe he said his cousin was a Slaylith and he was going to fight in this battle against this Regolith. And ultimately, we learn a little bit more about this Regolith. Now, this Regolith is dangerous because it is above a level 3. And I believe there's only 4 levels in total. You have the 1s, the 2s, 3s, and then the 4. Most of the time, 3s and 4s require multiple Slayliths to beat them. But what makes this one so likely powerful is that a demon is likely driving it. The demons were the ones who created the Regoliths to begin with, and in their Berserker state, the Regoliths are still very harmful. However, when they have a demon piloting them, they become exponentially more powerful because their potential is unlocked by the demons within them. So, we have this massive threat on the horizon. Ultimately, Bahamut's like, I think I'm a little bit too out of my water for this. But, yeah, so that is likely what we'll be saying, like, the setup for this massive fight to come on here shortly with a lot of Slayliths. I know we'll probably be getting introduced to more Slayliths, which will be the first new Slayliths we see in the Cannon Master series. After probably 4 chapters, like I said, I'll probably get introduced next chapter. So I'm really ready to see what these other Slayliths look like, because the Slayliths we see now are Ur and Bahamut, and they look really cool. So I cannot wait to see what the other ones have. So then on to Hunter x Hunter. Hunter x Hunter, I loved this week's chapter because it's like the good chapters of Hunter x Hunter. It wasn't too like overpacked with wordiness, but it also had like that it had the good art and it had comedy as well. Hunter x Hunter does best when it mixes a serious tone with comedy. And it's perfect when it does that, and it did very well here. So we see, ultimately, as we start off with the last chapter, ended with Kurapika introducing the fact that Wobble cannot participate, and everyone then ultimately ends up leaving. He's like, I want to postpone for a little bit and then come back, and we will then do our lesson then. So he then ends up going to Wobble's mother, and he's like, you know what, I can't remember her name for some reason, but he ultimately goes to her and he's like, kind of talking with her about it, and ultimately she's like, okay, I want you to test me to see if I'm telling the truth, because she's like, that child is not Beyond's child, and she's like, I've never had a child with Beyond, and ultimately Karate says, yeah, I believe you, but then the mother is like, you know, I want you to test me with your truth little bowl thing. So we see as he kind of gives some like warm-up questions and all that, just kind of calibrating, and then well, prior to this, I forgot to mention an important fact. We see as Kurapika refers to one of her attendants as Shimano, and she's like, my name is actually Shimanu. And this is important because in the Kakin dialect, I guess how stuff is pronounced makes it either masculine or feminine. Kind of like in Spanish with the spelling, but like, so Shimano would indicate that she is a man. However, Shimanu ultimately shows that she is a woman. And this becomes important later on, because we see as Kurapika goes on to testing the mother, and we also saw as Bill ultimately ended up, I think Bill? Crap, I'm blanking on the names. But yeah, he ultimately ended up telling Kurapika, yo, I noticed something here. And Kurapika gets his test in there, and ultimately he pulls out with the question of this, it mentions about how the child, the Wobble that is currently on the boat is not the same one as is her child. And then she freezes up. So, we in fact learn that the Wobble that is on the ship is in fact not the child of the King of Kakin. He is in fact the child of Wobble's actual mother's sister. And ultimately, this child was the one who actually underwent the seed urn ritual and all of that. And so, the actual Wobble is out somewhere. However, Kurapika runs into the idea, if the biological children of Beyond are killed, and this ultimately leads to the curse getting unleashed, then that's still going to affect the defenseless little Wobble who's out somewhere. So we got to figure out what to do with this and find Beyond's biological children so they don't die and end up ultimately activating their curses. So, we also see then as all the people arrive back, and most of them did, in fact, return for the Nin lessons, even with the knowledge that, Wobble is no longer a viable target because Wobble is technically not part of the game. So, that does disprove my theory that Wobble, well, I mean, not technically, but it also does disprove the theory that Wobble is not eligible for the games because he doesn't have a Nin Beast, or he or she doesn't have a Nin Beast. I believe Wobble is a girl. But, yeah. Because I was presuming that, however, no, it is in fact because they're not even part of the royal family. So yeah, we then, like I said, speaking of Beyond, we see as we end up going to Beyond in his cell, where he's approached by his lawyer in the cell, and ultimately they end up reading through some like lawsuits and stuff like that about like the general law of Kakin and all of that, and that's kind of where the chapter ends. I don't really know what importance that was, but I bet it'll probably be of significance next chapter next week. So I'm really ready to see what that had to do with anything, because it didn't seem super important. But yeah, so I'm just ready to see how that goes. And that was all there really was. it was a great week, really, for Shonen. Like, every chapter was good. Besides Underdoctor, Underdoctor was kind of a filler chapter. Like, it didn't really progress the story at all. I'm wondering why we're not learning more about Asclepius, because, like, Asclepius is important. It's big. I'm excited about Asclepius, but we're not focusing on them right now, which is kind of draining. But yeah, I guess that'll kind of hopefully change here in the next couple of weeks. So yeah, that's all it really was for episode 22 of Shonen Shorts, and that's all it really was for the July 5th issue of Weekly Shonen Jump. So thank you very much for watching.